Hey folks, Dan Lapel for New Focus Recordings. Great to be joined by Steve Ricks, whose second album with us, Assemblage Chamber, comes out later this month on May 27th, 2022. Hey Steve, how you doing?
Hey, great Dan.
So
Thanks,
this
thanks for talking to me.
oh, thanks for joining. Um, this is a really cool project and an interesting sort of left or right turn from the previous one you did with us, Young American Inventions. Uh, talk about it. In my imagination, this started with the piece for mixed quartet, right? And that has a harpsichord in it, and that sort of framed your direction of writing these pieces that were sort of Baroque influenced or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. So, Piece for Mixed Quartet was commissioned by the Nova Chamber Music Series, who's based in Salt Lake City. And it was meant to be premiered on a concert that included a Bach trio sonata. So it was for, that same instrumentation, harpsichord, cello, and two violins. And and that piece, so I wrote that piece. I was, generally happy with it. We recorded it, and then it just kind of sat there
Yeah,
because it was a little bit peculiar. I don't have a lot of. At that point, I didn't have any, particularly, Baroque inspired or with Baroque as a clear point of departure pieces.
yeah,
So I was kind of wondering, how this might fit with other pieces or that sort of thing. And in the meantime, all this time went by. And fast forward to, around 2017 or so, when you and I were talking about me writing you a piece and it being maybe kind of a mini concerto. And we ended up landing on working with counter induction. And for whatever reason, I kind of veered in a Baroque direction. I don't think it when I started that piece and started those ideas going, I necessarily thought, oh, this has to be Baroque inspired or has to connect with that other piece. But as it evolved and once it got finished, it's like, oh yeah, I mean, it kind of like now I've got these two pieces with this kind of clear Baroque influence.
right.
But yeah, and then I guess the last piece that ended up on this collection, well, the last two pieces kind of came most recently. This piece Heavy with Sonata was kind of written specifically with this disc in mind and just wanting to have more music on it that had a Baroque influence. And then the final electronic track, which is in itself a little bit of a left turn from the other pieces, but just takes clips and loops from all three of those other pieces and messes around with them. So
Yeah, cool. Well, maybe let's listen to a little bit of the piece for mixed quartet, and then maybe talk about some of the sort of interesting aesthetic interfaces here that come up. So we're gonna hear some of the first movement, Dance of the Spheres, and we're listening to the Nova Chamber Music Players, Gerald Elias on violin, Hasse Borup on violin. Am I saying that right? Uh,
Hassa, I think.
Hasse Borup, Walter Heyman on cello, and Jason Harding on harpsichord. Great. Well, there's a sort of a cubist quality to that opening harmonically. It's sort of looking at a collection from a bunch of different angles.
Yeah, so I mean the it's all the harmonic material in that first movement of mixed quartet is based on a single hexachord, a 6-note set that's comprised of two augmented triads a half step apart. And that sort of is a collection. I think some people call it the Schoenbergian hexachord, or anyway, it gives you lots of major and minor triads above the same root in a kind of cyclical manner, And so spheres, music of the spheres is one of those phrases, and that comes from older music theory and stuff that kind of reminded me of Renaissance and Baroque, and this idea that it's like constant motion, but in a sense, because it's a limited collection and because you kind of have those all these mediant relationships between the roots, you kind of never get anywhere. It's kind of like motion that's interesting, hopefully, and beautiful and interesting, but that doesn't have the same kind of linear flow. And also kind of grew out of just the fact that most of my music, it's you probably just say it's free atonal. I don't have a ton of triads in it. It just depends. But there's probably more 016 trichords or tritones and major sevenths and other things than major and minor triads. And so it was kind of a deliberate attempt on my part also to say, look, I'm going to write a piece that's in a dialogue with this Bach trio sonata. So I purposely want to have major and minor triads, but I want to approach it in a way that I'm more interested in, or that's not just me thinking of tonal progressions per se or whatever. So I kind of landed on that hexachord and liked it. And
Yeah, well, that's cool. It's like it has the same quality of the sort of methodical working out of harmonic relationships that you might find in sort of a sequential type situation in the Baroque, but the difference is it's not teleological harmonically. It just sort of circles around this collection. Yeah.
Right. And, honestly, probably about 90% of the material for that opening, before it received a little bit of massaging and revision, was generated by a little software program I created long ago with a student where, and other stuff like my piece Extended Play that you've played with your group had some of the same things where, like, I took all the different possible major and minor triads and all these different voicings, plug it into this little app, and then it kind of spews them out in a random order.
Yeah.
And so that adds another level, like you say, it's of whatever unpredictability or lack of clear linear flow or direction in some cases.
Yeah. Great. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, let's sort of put that in context with the most recent piece on the record, which is Heavy Width Sonata, which I think is maybe more overtly like setting up certain Baroque tropes and then like exploding them or deconstructing them or subverting expectation. Tell me a little bit about that piece.
Yeah, you bet. So, I mean, the point of departure with that piece is kind of the sonata da camera, and which, based on my non completely thorough investigation, is just typically a 3-movement work. That the first movement is a slow intro, usually in a triple meter, and then the other 2 movements would be just Baroque dance forms, the gigue or the sarabande or whatever, and they could kind of be, they might be different for each collection or sonata. And so, yeah, some of those, that overall 3-movement structure, and then those, some of the characteristics of those Baroque dance forms were things that I had in mind when I wanted to compose that piece, Heavy Width Sonata.
Yeah, great. It actually opens up the record and sort of, I don't know, lays out the a rhetorical argument in a cool way right at the opening with these sort of dotted French overture type rhythms. So let's check out a bit of that opening movement. And on this piece, we're hearing Aubrey Woods on violin, Alex Woods on viola, and Jason Hardink again on harpsichord. Very cool. So, when I think about your music in general, I often think about sort of collage type textures and juxtapositions of like maybe unlikely elements that you then sort of deconstruct and turn around and examine. I feel like that was happening a lot in Young American Inventions, and is sort of grabbing sonic associations from this sort of larger landscape and then smashing them together. Um, and I hear that on this record too, but the way that it's filtered through these sort of, it's not quite right to call them Baroque memes. I guess in 2022 maybe we hear them as memes, but uh, is really interesting because you've got this sort of very codified structure. I'm sort of interested in how that. Well, first of all, is that a fair characterization of what was going on in this particular piece, maybe specifically, but maybe a little bit in Palestri too? Uh, if not, then say no. If so, expand on the idea.
Yeah, I think the idea of collage and the idea of these chunks or elements that collide with each other and that then get deconstructed or layered or commented on, however you want to think about it, or all the different things you could do with some sort of chunk that has an identity. It's accurate to the way I'm thinking about it and developing the material. And so in Palestri, you've got this tonal sequential progression, which honestly it comes from an oral skills dictation textbook that my colleague Tom Durham created many years ago. And I just remember it was like, in the tonal harmony section and had this, chromatic ascending melody that had these, sequential chords supporting it. And I always just, it's one of those things where when I landed on it, practicing with my students, when I used to teach that sort of class, I was like, oh, that's kind of a cool progression. And so that's this chunk that I've actually been obsessed with for a while. And I did these MIDI studies with it and did all this stuff. And so I actually ended up, going back to this MIDI file I had and importing it in Finale and reworking it for counter induction and U for that passage in Palestri.
And then it shows up. Doesn't it show up a little bit in the third movement of Heavy With too?
Yes, it does. Yeah. And then again in the electronic track,
Right,
so
right, of course, yeah.
It's kind of a through a chunk that resurfaces, or a through line.
A leitmotif.
Yeah.
Well, actually, let's before you say more about it, let's go ahead and listen to that passage and sort of the way that you're cycling through this harmonic progression, but then you're sort of varying the ensemble and rhythmic entrances. It's almost like it creates like a glitchy type of situation going on. So this is counter induction playing a excerpt from reconstructing the lost improvisations of Aldo Palestri. Great. So that was so I didn't read the personnel, but I'm playing guitar on there. Miranda Cookson on violin, Jessica Meyer on viola, Caleb Vanderswag on cello, and Ben Finglin on bass clarinet. So sorry to interrupt you, but as you were talking about this sort of passage.
Well, yeah, there's that passage, but then in terms of Palestri, it's kind of episodic in a way that not necessarily all my pieces are. I don't know. I mean, I write a lot of material that feels transitional or that's kind of always on the move, but I feel like Palestri in a way it kind of has, there's still transitions maybe, but there's kind of more block form, you know, like here's a chunk that does this thing, then here's a chunk that does this thing. There's a little more juxtaposition at work. And maybe that's kind of what you're observing with a lot of these pieces. Of course, Palestri, you've got some overt Vivaldi quotes that get made, you know, done violence done to them. And I think if anything, another through line in these pieces, for better or worse, is that it's kind of like a kind of like a brutal, uninformed romp through Baroque music.
Right.
Or at least I'm being informed in very idiosyncratic ways and not worrying about, well, okay, this is true to this saraband form or whatever. It's just kind of grabbing, like, okay, saraband is this meter, so that's what I'm going to do in this meter, but I don't care if the other characteristics match up or not. You know, it's just kind of grasping at these chunks or ideas that are somewhat representative of this earlier music, but then just kind of doing what I will with them, and in some cases really deconstructing them or messing around with them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of moments in on the disc where it almost takes on like I don't know, it's right to call it a story within a story or a film within a film quality. Like you'll have this sort of very dense material going on, all of a sudden the harpsichord will be playing like something that actually sounds like it could be literally Couperin or something for a second. It's just like, okay, are we now like inside the piece watching another piece, and then that piece gets interrupted? You know, there's this sort of meta thing that starts to happen, which is cool.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and I love. Yeah, I mean, I love that idea in literature. Of course, an influence that I often cite is Kurt Vonnegut. You know, in the way he'll have quote, you know, talk about the Kilgore Trout short stories inside his novels,
Right.
And you kind of feel like when you're done reading a novel, like, wow, I've not only read this novel, I've also read 10 short stories. All you've got are like these 3-sentence synopsis of a short story or something.
Yeah.
So I love that idea of like embedding these moments in a larger piece that feel evocative of something else, but that kind of give it a greater depth or breadth or something. I don't know.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think we have to wrap up, but this was a great short chat. Sorry, I had to be a little on the short side, but maybe do you want to sort of close with anything? I'm going to mention some credits info, and then I think we're going to send things out with a little bit of the final electronic track, which is in a way like you're reckoning with maybe the process of going back in time a bit aesthetically and and then bringing it back and debriefing a bit.
Yeah, that electronic track kind of, evolved over a couple of years' time,
Yeah,
and went through various phases of like intense work and then being away from it for a while. And as you know, like we were discussing and debating, should it even be there or
yeah.
not? And I appreciate that you kind of said, well, it kind of speaks to most of the other work you do, as opposed to
I
this
love
very
that.
focused.
I think it just ties the record together beautifully and in a way that, at least for me, feels very consistent with how I think of you as an artist and a composer. So I'm glad that you allowed me to convince you to leave it on there.
Yeah, no, I think it was the right choice, and I'm
Yeah,
really glad it's there too. I like it, and
yeah,
I like the way I like it just as it on its own as
yeah,
an
totally.
interesting track to listen to. But I also think if someone is to listen to the whole disc, it would certainly kind of enhance or make the experience of listening to that final track a little more interesting, and just kind of hear the way these previously stated elements kind of come back in different ways or kind of
Yeah,
get
yeah,
butt up
and
against each
sampled
other.
and processed and whatever. And it also,
Yeah.
again, the Kilgore Trout thing. I mean, it doubles down on that as well, because now we're hearing some of the snippets of the short story in another story that's sort of like reflecting on the whole disc, and so many levels of meta going on here.
It's deep.
It's, that's
It's
what that's
deep.
what we go for here at New Focus Recording. Well, let me
Yeah.
shout out some other key figures here. Heavy With Sonata was recorded at Madison Recital Hall at BYU. Recorded, mixed, and edited by Jeff Carter. Ryan Strieber recorded the Palestri piece, and the mixed piece for mixed quartet was recorded in Libby Gardner Hall, University of Utah, Salt Lake City, by Carlton Vickers. And I'm blanking on the designer's name.
Doug Thomas.
Yes, Doug Thomas did the beautiful design.
Yeah, I love
Uh,
his design.
so this will be available all the places you'd expect to find music these days. Do check it out. FCR 328, Stephen Ricks, Assemblage Chamber, out on 5/27/2022. And we'll listen to a little bit of the final electronic track to send people out. And thanks so much, Steve, for hopping on Zoom, talking about the album a little bit. We're excited.
Thank you, Dan.
See you later. Take care.
Okay.